The emperor, while walking in the garden and discoursing on various subjects, spoke of the Institute, the manner in which it was composed, the spirit of its members. When he took his place in the Institute on his return from the army of Italy, he said he might consider himself as the 10th member in his class, which consisted of about 50. Lagrange, Laplace, and Monge were at the head of this class. It was rather a remarkable circumstance, and one which attracted considerable notice at the time. To see the young general of the army of Italy take his place in the Institute and publicly discuss profound metaphysical subjects with his colleagues. He was then called the geometrician of battles and the mechanician of victory. On becoming first consul, Napoleon caused no less sensation in the council of state. He constantly presided at the sittings for drawing up the civil code. Tronchet, he said, was the soul of this code, he said. Napoleon was its demonstrator. Tronchet was gifted with a singularly profound and correct understanding, but he could not descend to developments. He spoke badly and could not defend what he proposed. The whole council, said the emperor, at first opposed his suggestions, but Napoleon, with his shrewdness and facility of seizing and creating luminous and new relations, arose, and without any other knowledge of the subject and the correct basis furnished by Tronchet, developed his ideas, set aside objections, and brought everyone over to his opinions. The minutes of the Council of State have transmitted to us the extempore speeches of the first consul on most of the articles of the civil code. At every line we are struck with the correctness of his observations, the depth of his views, and in particular the liberality of his sentiments. Thus, in spite of the opposition that was set up to it, we are indebted to him for that article of the code which enacts that every individual born in France is a Frenchman. I should like to know, said he, what inconvenience can possibly arise from acknowledging every man born in France to be a Frenchman. The extension of the French civil laws can only be attended by advantageous consequences. Thus, instead of ordaining that individuals born in France of a foreign father shall obtain civil privileges only when they declare themselves willing to enjoy them, it may be decreed that they will be deprived of those rights only when they formally renounce them. If individuals born in France of a foreign father were not to be considered as enjoying the full privileges of Frenchmen, we cannot subject to the conscription and other public duties as some of those foreigners who have married in France through the events of war. I am of opinion that the question should be considered only with reference to the interests of France. Though individuals born in France possess no property, they are at least animated by French spirit, and they follow French customs. They cherish that attachment which everyone naturally feels for the country that gave them birth. Finally, they help to maintain the public burdens. The first consul distinguished himself no less by his support of the article which preserves the privileges of Frenchmen to children born of Frenchmen settled in foreign countries. And this law he extended in spite of powerful opposition. The French people, said he, who are a numerous and industrious people, are scattered over every part of the world, and in course of time they will be scattered about in still greater numbers. But the French visit foreign countries only to make their fortunes. The acts by which they seem momentarily to attach themselves to foreign governments have for their object only to obtain the protection necessary for their various speculations. If they should intend to return to France after realizing a fortune, would it be proper to exclude them? If it should happen that a country in the possession of France were to be invaded by the enemy and afterwards ceded to him by a treaty, would it be just to say to those of the inhabitants who might come to settle on the territory of the Republic that they had forfeited their rights as Frenchmen for not having quitted their former country at the moment it was ceded, and because they had sworn temporary allegiance to a new sovereign in order to gain time to dispose of their property and transfer their wealth to France? In another debate on the decease of soldiers, some difficulties having arisen relative to those who might die in a foreign country, the first consul claimed with vivacity the soldier's never abroad when he is under the national banner. The spot where the standard of France is unfurled becomes French ground. On the subject of divorce, the first consul was for the adoption of the principle and spoke at great length on the ground of incompatibility which it was attempted to repel. It is pretended, said he, that divorce is contrary to the interests of women and children and to the spirit of families, but nothing is more at variance with the interests of married persons when their humors are incompatible than to reduce them to the alternative of either living together or of separating with publicity. Nothing is more opposite to domestic happiness than a divided family. Separation had formerly, with regard to the wife, the husband, and the children, nearly the same effect as divorce, and yet it was not so frequent as divorce now is. It was only attended with this additional inconvenience that a woman of bad character might continue to dishonor her husband's name because she was permitted to retain it. When opposing the drawing up of an article to specify the causes for which divorce would be admissible, he said, "But it is not a great misfortune to be compelled to expose these causes and reveal even the most minute and private family details. Besides, when these causes, even in the event of their real existence, be always sufficient to obtain divorce, that of adultery, for instance, can only be successfully maintained by proofs, which is always very difficult, and sometimes even impossible to produce. Yet the husband, who should not be able to bring forward these proofs, would be compelled to live with a woman he abhors and despises, and who introduces illegitimate children into his family. His only resource would be separation from bed and board, but this would not shield his name from dishonor, resuming the support of the principle of divorce, and opposing certain restrictions. He continued, marriage is not always, as is supposed, the result of affection. A young female consents to marry for the sake of conforming to the fashion and obtaining independence and an establishment of her own. She accepts a husband of a disproportionate age and whose tastes and habits do not accord with hers. The law then should provide for her a resource against the moment when, the illusion having ceased, she finds that she is united in ill-assorted bonds, and that her expectations have been deceived. Marriage takes its form from the manners, customs, and religions of every people. Thus, its forms are not everywhere alike. In some countries, wives and concubines live under the same roof, and slaves are treated like children. The organization of families is therefore not deduced from the law of nature. The marriages of the Romans were not like those of the French. The precautions established by law for preventing persons from contracting unthinkingly at the age of 15 or 18 an engagement which extends to their whole lives are certainly wise. But are they sufficient? That after 10 years passed in wedlock, divorce should be admitted, but for very weighty reasons, is also a proper regulation, since however marriages contracted in early youth are rarely the choice of the parties themselves, but are brought about by their families for interested views. It is proper that if the parties themselves perceive that they are not formed for one another, they should be enabled to dissolve a union on which they had no opportunity of reflecting. The facility thus afforded them, however, should not tend to favor either levity or passion. It should be surrounded by every precaution and every form calculated to prevent its abuse. The parties, for example, might be heard by a secret family council held under the presidency of the magistrate. In addition to this, it might, if thought necessary, be determined that a woman should only once be allowed to procure divorce, and that she should not be suffered to remarry unless 5 years after, lest the idea of a second marriage should induce her to dissolve the first. That after married persons have lived together for 10 years, a dissolution should be rendered very difficult. To grant divorce only on account of adultery, publicly proved, is to prescribe it completely. For on the one hand, few cases of adultery can be proved, and on the other, there are few men shameless enough to expose the infamy of their wives. Besides, it would be scandalous, and the contrary to the honor of the nation, to reveal the scenes that pass in some families. It might be concluded, though erroneously, that they afford a picture of our French manners. The first lawyers of the council were of opinion that civil death should carry along with it the dissolution of the civil contract of marriage. The question was warmly discussed. The first consul, with great animation, opposed it in these terms: a woman is then to be forbidden, though fully convinced of her husband's innocence, to follow and exile the man to whom she is most tenderly united, or if She should yield to her conviction and to her duty. She is to be regarded only as a concubine. Why deprive an unfortunate married couple of the right of living together under the honorable title of lawful husband and wife? If the law permit a woman to follow her husband without allowing her the title of wife, it permits adultery. Society is sufficiently avenged by the sentence of condemnation when the criminal is deprived of his property and torn from his friends and his connections. Is there any need to extend the punishment to the wife and violently to dissolve a union which identifies her existence with that of her husband? Would she not say, "You had better have taken his life. I should then have been permitted at least to cherish his memory, but you ordain that he shall live, and you will not allow me to console him in his misery. Alas, how many men have been led into guilt only through their attachment for their wives? Those, therefore, who have caused their misfortunes should at least be permitted to share them. If a woman fulfill this duty, you esteem her virtue, and yet you are allowing her no greater indulgence than would be extended to the infamous wretch who prostitutes herself." Volumes may be filled with quotations of this sort. In 1815, after the Restoration, as I was conversing with Madame Bertrand de Molleville, formerly Minister of the Marine under Louis XVI, a man of great abilities and who has distinguished himself in more ways than one, he said, "Your Bonaparte, your Napoleon, was a very extraordinary man. It must be confessed, how little did we know him on the other side of the water. We could not but yield to the conviction of his victories and his evasions, it is true, but Genseric, Attila, and Alaric were as victorious as he. Thus he produced on me an impression of terror rather than of admiration. But since I have been here, I have taken the trouble to look over the debates on the civil code, and I have ever since been imbued with profound veneration for him. But where in the world did he collect all his knowledge? I discover something new every day. Ah, sir, what a man you had at the head of your government. Really, he was nothing short of a prodigy." About 5 o'clock, the Emperor received Captain Bowen of the Salsetta frigate, which is to sail tomorrow. He behaved very condescendingly to him in the course of conversation. The name of Lord St. Vincent, who the captain said was his patron, happened to be mentioned, on which the Emperor remarked, "You will see him on your return to England, and I commission you to present my compliments to him as to a good sailor, a brave and worthy veteran." About 7 o'clock, the Emperor took a bath. He sent for me, and we conversed a long time, first on the events of the day, then on literary subjects, and lastly on geography. He expressed his astonishment that we possessed no certain knowledge of the interior of Africa. I told him that I had entertained the idea some years ago of presenting to his Minister of Marine a plan of a journey into the interior of Africa, not a secret and adventurous excursion, but a regular military expedition in every respect worthy of the age and of the Emperor. The Minister laughed in my face when I first conversed with him on the subject and looked upon the idea as an absurdity. My plan was to have entered Africa at once at the north, south, east, and west, and to have formed a junction in the center, or starting only from the east and west. I proposed that the two divisions of the expedition should meet in the center, separate again, and proceed, one to the north, the other to the south. I thought it probable that after obtaining from the court of Portugal all the information that could be procured, it would be found that there already existed a communication from east to west, or that all events, very little was wanting to affect it. The state of public feeling at the time, our enthusiasm, our enterprises, our prodigies, would have rendered it easy to procure 500 or 600 good soldiers, with the requisite number of surgeons, physicians, botanists, chemists, astronomers, and naturalists, all willing to embark in the enterprise, and we should undoubtedly have accomplished something worthy of the age. The necessary supply of beasts of burden, small leathern boats for crossing rivers, skins for conveying water through the deserts, and light manageable field pieces would have rendered the execution of the enterprise easy and complete. "There is no doubt," said the Emperor, "but your idea would have pleased me. I should have taken it up, submitted it to the consideration of a committee, and brought it to a result." He said he very much regretted his not having had time during his stay in Egypt to accomplish something of this sort. He possessed troops calculated in every respect to brave the dangers of the desert. He had received presents from the Queen of Darfur, and had sent her some in return. Had he remained longer, he intended to have carried to a great extent our geographical investigations in the northern district of Africa. and that too by the simplest means, merely by placing in each caravan some intelligent officers for whom he would have procured hostages. The conversation then turned on the Marine Department under the imperial regime. The emperor entered very deeply into the subject. He could not say that he was satisfied with Decrès, and he even thought that the confidence he reposed in him was not altogether irreproachable. The difficulty of finding persons better qualified maintained him in his post, for after all, the emperor said Decrès was the best he could find. Cantillon was merely a sailor and was destitute of every other talent. Caffarelli, he said, had forfeited his good opinion because he had been informed that his wife intrigued in political affairs, which he regarded as an unpardonable offense. Missiessy was not a man to be depended on, for his family had been one of those who surrendered up to loan. The emperor had for a moment cast his eyes on Mémorial, but on consideration, he did not think he possessed adequate capability. He had asked himself whether T might not have filled the post, but he decided that he was not qualified for it. He was a good man of business, it is true, but he had plunged very deeply into the affairs of the revolution, and what had confirmed the emperor in his disapproval of him was that he had subsequently seen some of his private letters, by which it was evident that he still adhered to his old Jacobinical sentiments. I had observed the emperor rendered the duties of all my ministerial posts so easy that almost anyone was capable of discharging them if he possessed only fidelity, zeal, and activity. I must, however, accept the office of minister of foreign affairs, in which it was frequently necessary to exercise a ready talent for persuasion. In fact, continued he, in the Marine Department but little was required, and Decrès was perhaps, after all, the best man I could have found. He possessed authority, and he discharged the business of his office scrupulously and honestly. He was endowed with a good share of understanding, but this was evinced only in his conversation and private conduct. He never conceived any plan of his own and was incapable of executing the ideas of others on a grand scale. He could walk, but he could never be made to run. He ought to have passed one half of his time in the seaports or on board the exercising squadrons. He would have lost none of my favor by so doing. But as a courtier, he was afraid to quit his portfolio. This shows how little he knew me. He would not have been the less protected by removing from my court. His absence would have been a powerful circumstance in his favor. The emperor said he very much regretted Latouche Treville, whom he regarded as a man of real talent. He was of opinion that admiral would have given a different impulse to affairs. The attack on India and the invasion of England would by him have been at least attempted and perhaps accomplished. The emperor blamed himself for having employed the pinnaces at Bologna. He said it would have been better had he employed actual ships at Cherbourg. He was of opinion that had Villeneuve manifested more vigor at Cape Finisterre, the attack might have been rendered practicable. I had made arrangements for the arrival of Villeneuve with considerable art and calculation, and in defiance of the opinions and the routine of the naval officers by whom I was surrounded. Everything happened as I had foreseen, but the inactivity of Villeneuve ruined all. But, added the emperor, heaven knows what instructions he might have received from Decrès, or what letters might have been privately written to him, which never came to my knowledge. For though I was very powerful and was fond of searching into everything, yet I am convinced that I was far from knowing all that was passing around me. The Grand Marshal said the other day that it used to be remarked in the saloon of the household that I was never accessible to anyone after I had an audience with the Minister of the Marine. The reason was because he never had any but bad news to communicate to me. For my part, I gave up everything after the disaster of Trafalgar. I could not be everywhere. I had enough to occupy my attention with the armies of the continent. I had long meditated on a decisive expedition to India, but my plans had been constantly frustrated. I intended to have fitted out a force of 16,000 troops on board ships of the line, each 74 to have taken 500 troops on board, which would of course have required 32 ships. I proposed that they should take in a supply of water for 4 months, which supply might have been renewed at the Isle of France, or in any habitable spot of the desert of Africa, Brazil, or the Indian Ocean. In case of need, they might have taken in water wherever they chose to cast anchor. On reaching the place of the destination, the troops were to be put ashore, and the ships were immediately to depart, making up the number of their crews by the sacrifice of 7 or 8 of the vessels which might be condemned as unserviceable, so that an English squadron arriving from Europe immediately after would have found no trace of ours. As for the army, when abandoned to itself and placed under the command of a clever, confidential chief, it would have renewed the prodigies that were familiar to us, and Europe would have beheld the conquest of India, as she had already seen the conquest of Egypt. I knew Decrès well. We had both commenced our career together in the marine. I think he entertained for me all the friendship of which he was susceptible, and I, on my part, was tenderly attached to him. It was an unfortunate passion, as I used to say when I was rallied on the subject, which was frequently the case, for Decrès was very much disliked, and I have often thought that from some motive or other he took pleasure in his own unpopularity. At St. Helena, as elsewhere, I found myself almost his only defender. I saw a great deal of him while the Emperor was at the island of Elba, and he was occasionally favorable to Napoleon. We conversed candidly on the subject, and I have every reason to believe that he observed full and entire confidence with respect to me. No sooner had your Majesty returned to the Tuileries, said I to the Emperor, than Decrès and I ran to embrace each other, exclaiming, "His return! We have him again!" His eyes were suffused with tears. I must bear this testimony to his feelings. "Well," said he to me, in the presence of his wife, "I am now convinced that I have often done you wrong, and I owe you reparation. But your old habits and connections so naturally brought you in contact with those who are now about to quit us that I doubted not but you would sooner or later be perfectly reconciled with him, though you were perhaps often offended at the expression of my real sentiments." "And did you believe this, you simpleton?" exclaimed the Emperor, bursting into a fit of laughter. This was an excellent piece of courtier-like art, a touch for La Bruyere. It was really a good idea on the part of Decrès, for if during my absence anything offensive to me had chanced to escape him, he would, you see, by this means have atoned for it once for all. "Well, sire," continued I, "what I have just told you is perhaps only amusing, but what I will now communicate is of a more important nature. During the crisis of 1814, before the taking of Paris, Decrès was sounded in a very artful way as to his inclination to conspire against your Majesty, and he honestly repelled the suggestion. Decrès was easily and often roused to discontent, and he possessed a certain air of authority in his language and manners, which rendered him a useful acquisition to any party he might espouse. He happened at the unhappy period I have just mentioned to visit a person of celebrity, the hero of the machinations of the day. The latter advanced to Decrès, and drawing him aside to the fireplace, took up a book, saying, "I have just now been reading something that struck me forcibly. You shall hear it. Montesquieu, in such and such a chapter page, says, when the prince rises above the laws, when tyranny becomes insupportable, the oppressed have no alternative but..." "Enough!" exclaimed Decrès, putting his hand before the mouth of the reader. "I will hear no more. Close the book." And the other coolly laid down the volume as though nothing particular had occurred, and began to talk on a totally different subject. On another occasion, a certain marshal, after his fatal defection, alarmed at the ill impression which his conduct was calculated to produce on the public mind, and vainly seeking the approbation and support of those who surrounded him, endeavored to interest Decrès in his favor. "I have always borne in mind," said he to Decrès, "one of our conversations in which you so energetically painted the evils and perplexities that weighed upon the country. The force of your arguments greatly influenced me in the step which I took with the view of alleviating our misfortunes." "Yes, my dear fellow," replied Decrès, "but it did not also occur to you that you overshot your mark? In order that these anecdotes may be appreciated as they deserve," said I to the Emperor, "I must inform your Majesty that they were related to me by Decrès himself during your absence, and when he certainly entertained no idea of your return." The Emperor maintained the conversation for nearly 2 hours in the bath. He did not dine till 9 o'clock, and he desired me to stay with him. We discoursed about the military school at Paris. He left the school only a year before Napoleon entered it, and therefore the same officers, tutors, and comrades were common to us both. He took particular pleasure in reverting with with me to this period of our youth in reviving the recollection of our occupations, our boyish tricks, our games. In this cheerfulness of humor, he called for a glass of champagne, which was rather an unusual thing, for such is his habitual abstinence, that a single glass of wine is sufficient to flush his face and to render him very talkative. It is well known that he seldom sits longer than a quarter of an hour or half an hour at table, but today we had sat upwards of 2 hours. He was very much surprised. And Marchand, at 4 noon, it was 11 o'clock. How rapidly the time has slipped away, said he with an expression of satisfaction. Why can I not always pass my hours thus agreeably? My dearest Casa, said he, as he dismissed me. You leave me happy. The 13th, Dr. Warden and 2 other medical gentlemen came to hold a consultation on my son, whose indisposition alarmed me. The Emperor, at my request, consented to receive Dr. Warden, our old acquaintance of the Northumberland. He conversed for upwards of 2 hours familiarly, taking a review of those acts of his government which had drawn upon him the greatest share of enmity, falsehood, and calumny. As the doctor afterwards observed to me, nothing could be more correct, clear, curious, and satisfactory than these details. The Emperor concluded with the following remarkable observations. I concern myself but little about the libels that have been written against me. My acts and the events of my reign refute them more completely than the most skillful arguments that could be employed. I seated myself on an empty throne. I arrived at supreme power, unsullied by the crimes that have usually disgraced the chiefs of dynasties. Let history be consulted. Let me be compared with others. If I have to fear the reproaches of posterity in history, it is not for having been too wicked, but perhaps for being too good. After dinner, the Emperor looked at the Dictionnaire de Girouette, the Dictionary of Weathercocks, which is humorously conceived, though not so well executed. It is an alphabetic collection of the living characters who have figured on the scene of public events since the Revolution and whose language, opinions, and conduct have followed the variation of the wind. Weathercocks are affixed to their names with an abstract of the speeches or a description of the acts which have procured for them the distinction. On opening the work, the Emperor inquired whether any of us were mentioned in it. No, sire, someone present jokingly replied. None, save your majesty. The name of Napoleon was indeed recorded in the work because, as it was affirmed, he had first sanctioned the Republic and then assumed the prerogative of royalty. The Emperor read to us several articles from the dictionary. The contrast exhibited at different times in the language and conduct of certain individuals was truly curious, and the transition was, in some instances, performed with so much coolness and effrontery that the Emperor several times suspended his reading and burst into hearty fits of laughter. However, after going through a few pages, he closed the book with an expression of disgust and regret, observing that, after all, the publication was a disgrace to society, a code of turpitude, and a record of our dishonor. One article seemed to affect him deeply, namely that on Berthollet, whom he had so loaded with favor and on whom he said he had every reason to rely. The following charming trait in the Emperor's character may be mentioned here, though it is pretty generally known. Berthollet had sustained losses which involved him in difficulties. When the circumstances having come to the Emperor's knowledge, he sent him 100,000 crowns. Adding that he had reason to complain of him, since he seemed to have forgotten that he, Napoleon, was always ready to serve his friends. Berthollet, however, behaved very ungratefully to the Emperor at the period of his disasters. His conduct deeply affected Napoleon at the time, and he was often heard to exclaim, "What, Berthollet, on whom I thought I could rely with such confidence?" On the Emperor's return from Elba, Berthollet seemed again inclined to manifest his former sentiments of attachment to his benefactor. He ventured to show himself at the Tuileries and desired Monge to inform the Emperor that if he did not obtain a sight of him, he would put a period to his existence. The moment he left the palace, the Emperor could not refuse his request and saluted him with a smile as he passed by. During his reign, the Emperor had conferred repeated favors on several great manufacturers, among others on Uberkamp, Richard Lenoir. He wished to look for their names in the dictionary, but every voice was raised to bear witness to their good conduct.